So we're going to begin this part of the program, and I'd like to welcome Linden MacIntyre and Don Gillmor to the sofa. Five. On my practice run in this chair, I now know why Strombo sits on the edge. These leather sofas aren't made for interviews, maybe, but we'll make the best of it. So our two authors probably don't need an introduction, but I'll give it a go. Linden MacIntyre. Beginning in 1990, Linden MacIntyre was the co-host of CBC Television's investigative program, The Fifth Estate. MacIntyre has won 9 Gemini Awards, including 3 Gordon Sinclair Awards for Best Overall Broadcast Journalist. He has written and reported for numerous other award-winning projects, including an International Emmy, To Sell a War, several awards for The Trouble with Evan, Promises of Glory, and the Mishner Award for Public Service and Journalism, His Word Against History, Stephen Truscott's Story, and Scandal of the Century. He has also written and presented award-winning documentaries for the PBS program Frontline. MacIntyre's first novel, the first in the trilogy known as the Long Stretch Trilogy, was published in October '99, and his first nonfiction book, Who Killed Ty Khan, which was co-authored by Teresa Burke, was published in 2000. His second novel, The Bishop's Man, which a lot of us, we know that book well, was published in August 2009, and it won the 2009 Scotiabank Giller Prize. He has also published a memoir in 2006, Causeway, A Passage from Innocence, which we found out last night when we were chatting, mentions my hometown, my village, Bay St. Lawrence, where his mother grew up and my family and friends still live. Linden will be at Words this year on the heels of his 4th novel, Punishment. And now to Don Gillmor. He's an award-winning novelist, journalist, and children's book author. His new novel, Long Change, examines the world of oil through the life and loves of one man, Rit. His previous novel, Mount Pleasant, is a darkly comic meditation on privilege and debt, which is set in contemporary Toronto, and his first novel, the critically acclaimed Kanata, is also it examines the whole sweep of Canadian history. And of course, he's also the author of the 2-volume history, Canada, A People's History, and 3 other books of nonfiction. He has written 9 books for children, 2 of which were nominated for a Governor General's Award. His journalism and criticism have appeared in The Walrus, where he was a senior editor, Saturday Night, and also Toronto Life. He was a contributor editor there. He's written for Rolling Stone and GQ, the Globe and Mail, and a number of other national publications. He has won 10 National Magazine Awards and numerous other honors. And as I understand it, they live close by one another in Toronto, is that right? So welcome, neighbors Linden and Don. So if you could allow me, before I ask you to maybe take the podium and read some selections from your newer works, I was hoping to bring the conversation around to the beginning of writing for both of you. For Don, there's a scene early on in Long Change, and it's between Rit and Oda. These are very tender scenes, and there's a moment where they're reading together. The quote goes, "He read 5 pages, then stopped to ask why, if Tolstoy was a count, would he even bother writing books? Oda looked at him, then said he had no choice. He had to write. It was inside him." Is that also true of your life as a writer?
Well, I hope so, although, if I did win a lottery, who knows? I mean, it's never been tested, so I don't know for sure.
So you're not a count?
Not yet, no.
And could you tell me the moments which you started to think of yourself as a storyteller, as a writer, as someone who wanted to explore the world through the written word?
Well, I think as a storyteller, probably early on. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you just kind of, it happens naturally. It happened in university, maybe. And in university, that's when I wanted to become a writer. But I had no idea how to go about it, as odd as that sounds, because you just have to sit down with a pen. But I kind of hovered over the idea for a long time before I really started to put that into practice.
Do you remember the first time or some of the first times you put pen to paper and really tried to pursue that activity?
Well, I do, and it actually is this book, which has to do with the oil business. I tried to write something about oil when I was about 23, and I realized I had the material, but I just didn't have any way of putting it down in the way that I wanted to, and I realized I needed more seasoning and more time. And I mean, it took me a long time to get to novel writer, and then finally with this book, getting back to that subject. But it was a long process.
Wonderful, thank you. Present company excluded. One of my favorite authors is Paul Auster from Brooklyn. And he was a poet for a long time, and his turn toward prose was actually in and around a family memoir. You had a family memoir was it in 99?
It was around 99, yeah.
Yeah, and you were a writer before that in publications and popular newsprint?
I was, and that book was actually based on, I had done a magazine piece for, back when there was, the Globe used to have a travel magazine, back when the budgets were massive, and they would send you anywhere in the world, basically. And I wrote a travel piece that had to do with finding my kind of Celtic and Scottish roots, and it had to do with finding out who my grandmother was, because there was some mystery about her birth. And so what I uncovered there became a magazine piece, but I realized it was a much larger story, and that turned into a book which was called The Desire of Every Living Thing.
Wonderful, thank you. That'll provide a good segue, I think, to ask you, Linden, about your memoir, Causeway.
The stranger in my life was a closer relative than the stranger in Don's life. My father was an itinerant miner, and he was, which meant that he was. I'm amazed nowadays. People complain they work in Fort Mac and they get sent home every couple of weeks for a week or 10 days, and then they get flown back. When my father was going to places like Fort Mac to work as a miner, he might get home for Christmas. He might get a week off in the summertime, but for most of the time, the only time he ever got home, it was to try and find work closer to home, and he invariably failed. So I found myself an adult trying to get to know the guy, and just as we were sort of making a little headway, I was 25 and he was 50, he dropped dead one day. And so it was a great shock, and so I found myself and I only came to this conclusion after a while. I was obsessed with who he was. And simultaneously, I had written a book or two, but I was struggling with the books, and I was asked to write a memoir. And I didn't want to write a memoir about, because I knew what they were getting at, my life as a journalist and all the interesting places I have been. And these things turned into really embarrassing vanity projects in many cases, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. But then I thought, the very best memoirs, like the one you just described, have to do with other people. It's how you see other people. So I said, this is a perfect vehicle for me to explore who my old man was, and why his life was such a completely unsuccessful project. How did that happen? And so that's where the memoir came from, basically.
Right, thank you. And if I could riff on what Don said, he's thinking back to the university days and trying to move in that direction. If you wouldn't mind, Linden, there's a really great story in your memoir, and it's to do with the eavesdropping you would do as a child when you listen into adult conversation. Could you maybe explain that to the audience and how that led you to become a storyteller?
Well, I don't know if anybody here is old enough to remember houses that had no central heating. And so it was my good fortune to live in, have a little bedroom just up above the kitchen. And there was a hole where the chimney passed up too, so my room had heat because the chimney went up too, and there was a hole around the chimney so that the heat came up from the kitchen. Well, also the voices come up from the kitchen, and and every evening, I mean, back in those days, people would listen to the radio for stories, but there was no TV. And the most compelling and most interesting stories were the ones that came in through the door and sat down with a cup of tea or a glass of rum or whatever. Right. And I'm sitting up there listening to these stories, and I came to the conclusion at a very early age, all kids like attention. And I deduced very early on that the two best ways to get attention from adults is to be able to tell a story or play a fiddle. Because we had a fiddle player boarding at the house one winter, and he used to practice in the kitchen, and he turned into quite a world-famous Scottish fiddle player.
This is Buddy.
Buddy McMaster. And so Buddy was sitting in the kitchen playing his fiddle. I was up listening to it, and I said, wow, I wish I could do that, but that's a non-starter, so I'm going to tell stories.
And Don, you said your background was also, you had some Celtic background and some Scottish background as well?
Yeah.
Would storytelling resonate in your home or in your community?
Well, in my home it did. In my Scottish background, they were the opposite of storytellers. When I went to Scotland, one of my relatives, a guy named Robert Ross, and he was the minister in the Free Presbyterian Church, which is basically a kind of unreconstituted Calvinist. And I went to see him on Sunday because he was preaching, and I was there first, and there's only 7 people in the congregation, and the church probably held 600, and there was 7 of us. So, I went over to the first person who arrived and put out my hand, introduced myself, and she actually backed away from me all the way to the wall, and I thought, what have I done? And it turned out that they're not allowed to talk on Sundays unless they're talking about the Lord. So that's my people. They were the opposite of storytellers. They didn't say anything, and he lived in a village that had 7 houses. Gillmor was called. They had 7 houses in the village, and 2 of the houses had been feuding for 2 generations and hadn't spoken to each other. So that's the storytelling background that I have. Yeah.
In those communities, and this is apparently true, they used to take, on Sundays, they would put the rooster under what they call a creel, which was a basket that you carried peat in, and so the rooster would be kept under the basket all during the Sabbath in order that he didn't get up to mischief with the hens. But one of the most important transitional moments in my storytelling, it came during university. Listening at the whole, you find out this is a great way to get attention and spend your life easier than working in the mines. And that's what I'm going to do. So I was taking a creative English course at the university, and the professor was quite a renowned locally. He was Father McSween, you might have.
Yes.
Moonbeam McSween, we used to call him. But he was a published poet, and he was a short story writer, and he was an authority on T.S. Eliot and all that stuff. He was quite an intellect. So he would give us out assignments, and I remember going over to his quarters one evening to get a feedback on something I had written. And the feedback was fairly blunt.
And this was at St. Francis Xavier
St.
in
FX
Antigonish, Nova
University.
Scotia.
The advice he gave me was avoid trying to write anything. And he says, you just can't do it. And for one thing, he said, you have a sentimental streak. But he said, more important than that, you don't know anything yet. So now, I suppose a more tender, sentimental person than I was, even though he thought I was, would go off and hang themselves. But I took it on board, and I decided to become a journalist since I couldn't write. And during the course of journalism, I learned enough to persuade myself after many, many years, well, maybe I got something to write about now. So I owe it all to Father McSween, preventing me from going out and completely making an idiot out of myself before I had anything to say.
And I think he's had a profound influence on a number of writers that
yeah.
came out of that department.
But he used to pick favorites, and it's interesting that an awful lot of the people he thought had a streak of genius in them didn't. So he wasn't infallible.
Just maybe to bounce off that, did you have a teacher or a professor in your life who gave you good advice or bad advice?
I didn't have the nurturing Catholics that Linden had. I never really did. I had one brilliant teacher in my entire student career, and it was in grade 12, and it was actually a social studies teacher. What he did implant in me was the idea of narrative, because he would tell these stories of history, and he'd act out the Second World War. And it was the first time I'd ever seen any kind of class conducted that way. And you got caught up in these stories, and he'd have he'd be in the control room with Hitler and Himmler and Goebbels, and he'd act out all these parts, and they're plotting on invading Poland. And all that stuff would stick with me because he put it into a narrative form. And it was really, it was very instructive, because you recognize that this is such a much better way to learn. And when I wrote the Canada People's History, it was with that in mind, that this would be a story rather than, David Thompson discovered this river in 1831. You would tell this dramatic story and the backstory and the sort of unknown parts of someone's life.
Thank you for sharing. I think that's a good way to move into having these storytellers share some passages from their latest publications. Dom, would you like to start? I believe so. If not, we'll double back.
I think it is working. So I'd like to read from Long Change. This book is, it's a story of one man's life, a guy named Rit Devlin, and it starts from the age of 15 and it goes up into his 80s, and it's seen through the lens of the three women that he loved. And it's set against the backdrop of the oil world. I'd wanted to write something about oil for a long time, because I moved to Calgary in 1970 during the very beginnings of the oil boom, and I went to University of Calgary in the summertime. I worked on the oil rigs, and the first time I went out there, I'd heard you'd make a lot of money there, so I went and applied at oil companies, and finally a receptionist said, there's no point in dropping off your CV. You have to actually drive out to the rigs, and the turnover is so high, just drive east towards Medicine Hat. So a friend of mine and myself did, and you could see the derricks from about 30 kilometers away on the prairie, and the first derrick we went up to, there's a guy sitting on a 40-gallon drum, and his hand is all wrapped in bandages, and there's blood all over his pants, and he's slumped over, and there's a sign behind him that says, "This rig has worked 0 accident-free days." And so we thought, well, there's a job opening here. So we applied for this poor guy's job. We didn't get it because we didn't have any experience, but we drove around for about 5 days, and finally we got to this rig, and the driller's whole crew hadn't shown up. And they were all, it was about halfway through the shift, they were all drunk or in jail or had quit or some combination of those. And so he looked at us, and this was early 70s. We had long hair and Grateful Dead t-shirts and maybe not ideal oil field material. And he just shook his head and said, well, I guess you girls will have to do. And so that was the beginning of my life in oil, such as it was. And I worked off and on the rigs through university. And then when I graduated, because I was an English major, and I kept going back, partly because of the money, but also partly because it was such a fascinating subculture, and there was a kind of Hemingway-esque romance and sense of adventure to it. So when I graduated, I wanted to go to Spain because I was still in my Hemingway phase, and I thought, well, I'll work on a rig for 100 days straight, and then I'll go to Europe for a while. And so I worked on this rig south of Calgary, and it was probably the oldest rig crew in the history of the oil fields, and they were all in their 60s, which doesn't seem that old now, but at the time it seemed ancient. And so I worked in this crew, and they were all the guys were divorced, and except for the driller, who became divorced while I was there. And he blamed his divorce on a record that his wife had bought. It was titled Super Sobbers, the saddest country songs ever written. And, country music has already set the bar pretty high as far as sad songs go, so you can imagine what the 10 saddest sounded like. And she would listen to these all day long, and he'd come home and she's weeping and listening to these songs of leaving and cheating and hurting. And so he finally took it off the turntable and threw it against the wall and broke it. And she bought another one and he broke that, and then she bought 10, and so this escalated, and she finally divorced him. And so I said, I was commiserating. I said, well, it's kind of too bad your wife has left you. And he said, it's not a problem. He said, I'm going to have no trouble finding another wife. He said, and he listed his attributes, which were steady job and a working truck and never at home. And he said, what woman wouldn't be swept off her feet by that? So and just before I left for Spain on my last day on the rigs, the derrick man, who was a mournful old alcoholic named Pete, he took me aside, and he had told me earlier that his wife had left him 10 years earlier. He'd come home from a binge, and the whole house had been cleaned out. That all the furniture was gone, even the curtains were gone. And there was a note in the middle of the bare floor that said, "Your dinner's in the oven." But she had taken the stove with her, so he took me aside and to give me relationship advice. And he said, he knew I was going to Spain, and he said, if you marry a woman who doesn't speak English, it'll solve a lot of problems. So the rigs, they weren't a great place for relationship advice, but they were this interesting place for these stories. And so I kept these stories with me, and I thought, well, someday I'll do something about it. And the book was precipitated by a Globe piece that came out years and years later, and it was about a Calgary oil man named Earl Jowdry, who had been shot 6 times by his wife, Dorothy. And he didn't die, and in fact, apparently didn't lose consciousness. And so I always thought there was going to be a follow-up story that would tell us what happened here. And because I thought, at the very least, what do you say to your wife after she shot you 6 times? What did they talk about? And so I always thought, that story sort of encapsulated a moment in Calgary's boom history, because the whole city there was a kind of collective madness in the 70s. And I thought there was, in this crime, I thought there was a sort of civic zeitgeist, and that there was thousands of women sitting around Calgary pouring their 3rd Crown Royal and just kind of mentally shooting their husband 6 times as he droned on about the price of oil. And so I sat down and I wrote that scene, a fictional version of that scene. So the characters don't bear any resemblance to Dorothy and Earl, but the situation's exactly the same. And I wrote that scene. I was working on another book, but I took time off and wrote that scene, and that became the genesis of this book. And I'd just like to read a short passage. This happens later in the book, where Rit, who's got a background in geology, and he's become a very successful oil man, but he's on his 3rd marriage now to a woman named Alexa. Marriage isn't going brilliantly, because the next scene is when he gets shot, in fact. And so they're at a dinner party, and everyone's been drinking far, far too much. And Rit has had so much to drink that he's actually experiencing what could be called a geologic hallucination, I guess. Rit felt a tickle at his feet and looked down and saw that sand was filling the room like liquid, covering the floor, his toes disappearing. He stared for a long moment. The quaternary period finally passing. It had to go sometime. Geologic time, suddenly in a hurry, a speeded-up time-lapse version, the sand still loose, not yet compressed into stone by the weight of another era. It was hardening, though, he could feel it. Who could argue with the progress they'd made in the quaternary? Agricultural, tools, civilizations, a few disagreements along the way. And now a layer would form containing 90 million discarded computers, 4 feet of half-eaten takeout in styrofoam containers, jeans that didn't really fit, outmoded cell phones. It piled so high but compressed to almost nothing. The formation was the color of weak coffee. Another strata inched upwards. His legs disappeared. It threatened the table, threatened Al's half-filled water glass, Nancy's fourth husband, Dickie's nameless wife, and her uneaten dinner. It would soon take Dickie's jokes, louder and more inappropriate as the evening staggered on. It would bury all of Alexa's resentments. Her face was florid, her anger leaking out at first in sharp, bitter comments. And then the dam burst, and she was telling Rit there should have been a vegetarian option, pointing to the untouched meat, then telling the two vegetarians to get with the program, Bambi. The encroaching strata would cover Alice's recent facelift. It would cover Morris Swain's unsubtle implants. This was how time passed, slowly at first. You hardly noticed the years go by. Then suddenly everything changed. Everyone got old in a hurry. There was relief when a period ended, nostalgia certainly. The Cretaceous mourned its own passing. We were living large. The world is smaller now. The incoming Paleogene insisted that those dinosaurs were out of touch. They deserved to die. Clumsy, slow. God and evolution working together couldn't come up with a worse idea. They took up too much space, ate everything in sight. They thought they invented sex. And those stories, it's a miracle they didn't die of boredom. We're younger, we're faster, we're smarter. The Paleogene is going to last forever. Who could have seen the Neogene coming? Birds, mammals, grass everywhere. Massive forests shot up and sucked up all that carbon dioxide, thank God. Homo habilis arrived. Not much of a reception, barely human. Hairy sex and lunch for the faster animals. Stone tools, and that's on a good day. Grab a fucking brain. You had to look at the big picture. In the very beginning, the Extasian, quiet as church. Just that uneventful landmass and seas with colonies of green algae floating serenely. It only took 4 billion years for those single, clueless cells to evolve into Larry, Curly, and Moe poking each other in the eye. A candle fell over, spilling wax onto the table. It covered the empty plates stacked awkwardly at the kitchen counter, the uneaten meat and pools of blood. On the table, all those wine bottles, the half-eaten flan, the handful of blueberries in the ceramic bowl they'd bought in Italy. The 12 of them were now encased almost to their chests. Here is where height is an evolutionary advantage. Compact Nancy, already a casualty, just the top of her head showing, the smallest hint of gray roots at the part. Dickie's wife breathing through her nose, worrying about her weight. How much spinach is too much, she thought. And Dickie had one more joke for us. So this consultant takes his new wife fishing, ha ha, he said. Alexa's open, angry mouth filled with sediment, her eyes showing surprise, though you couldn't say we didn't see it coming. Suddenly stifled, and Rit felt relief at this and felt guilty for that relief. Their eyes met along the runway length of the table, and Rit saw neither love nor fear in his wife's expression, just the mutual recognition of a dying species. The strata was at Rit's own chin, settling fast. Below his waist, it was already stone. The winds howled, the sky opened, the house was blown away, the timbers flying east, the dark clouds close enough to touch, it seemed, if his arms had been free. The end of an era, and you want a bit of a show, something to remember. It was past his mouth now, too, only his eyes surveying what was left. He wanted a divorce. This much was clear. He wanted out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Don. When that passage appears in the novel, it's completely arresting, and I think it announces an interesting change toward the end. So thank you for sharing that piece. I pulled it up in my notes, too. It's really, really beautiful piece. Linden, would you like to share a piece?
Well, anybody who's grown up in a small place, and you just mentioned where you grew up, there are two things you don't want to see in front of your house any given time. One is the RCMP officer's car and the in-priest's car, because either of those vehicles indicates that somebody's going on a long journey. And in the community I grew up in, it wasn't uncommon. You always knew where the cop car was going to show up, because there was usually one person in the community who was sort of the lightning rod when stuff disappeared from a house, an empty house, or from a store or wherever. You always knew where to start the investigation. And sometimes the investigation led you to a real understanding of what had happened and to a real culprit, and restoration happened and justice was done. Quite frequently, though, the lightning rod had nothing to do with it, but that didn't prevent him or her from becoming a kind of a scapegoat. So this is essentially a story about one of those people. A young guy named Dwayne Strickland grew up as a sort of an outsider in this tight little community, and appropriately was blamed for most of the miserable things that happened while he was growing up, but sometimes he wasn't. He was blamed but not responsible. And as often happens with young people who tend to be blamed, whether they did it or not, or instantly blamed, they decide, okay, I'm going to be blamed for it anyway, so I might as well do it. And this is the way Dwayne Strickland ended up in the penitentiary, where a fellow from home who had grown up also as a bit of an outsider in the community, but worked harder at being part of the community, where he was working as a parole officer at this point. And he meets up with Dwayne in the prison system, and Dwayne isn't a particularly likable guy, but there's obviously something about him that's worth paying attention to and hopefully rehabilitating. Tony, who is the parole officer, gets into a spot of trouble in the prison system himself, and he ends up losing his job and simultaneously his marriage. And in a very short period of time, Tony finds himself back where he grew up, trying to figure out what to do. He's only in his mid-50s, and he's trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. And he's got a lot of time on his hands, and just the opening paragraph of the book sets the story up. The scuffle at the courthouse made the Metro papers, and I should have known from past experience how the validation of a headline can unleash the hounds of vengeance in all their myopic savagery. Angry relatives of dead teen confront accused killer. There were obviously other factors driving what unfolded in the months that followed, but as I look back, I see the headline as a catalyst for passions that inflamed the public mind, causing reason to evaporate. But let me start at the beginning. So the beginning is an afternoon at the courthouse. He goes down there to pay his taxes. He sees a commotion out back of the courthouse. He sees police vehicles, sheriff's vehicle going around. He sees a little crowd. He goes. The door of the police vehicle opens up, and who should come out but Dwayne Strickland? And now Dwayne Strickland is in deep trouble. They're accusing him of killing somebody, a young woman who happens to have been like the princess of the community, who found dead in his place of a drug overdose, and they claim that she would not have voluntarily taken all those drugs, that he must have put them into her somehow in order to get some advantage over her. Now, Tony knows this guy as being not that sort of a dude. He knows he's capable of doing all sorts of things, so he hangs around, and he happens to meet the grandmother of the victim, who was his teenage sweetheart, and who jilted him badly. And he never understood for a long time why she did it. And he has seen very little, I've hardly seen anything of her in decades. And suddenly there she is, the grandmother of the victim of a crime allegedly committed by somebody that Tony knows quite well. So as you can tell, Tony is going to be back in the middle of something in a place that he's not ready to deal with. So a scuffle breaks out. Other relatives of the victim try to get at poor Dwayne as he's being taken to the cells, and the police break it up. So Tony is left wondering, what's this all about, and how am I going to respond to it? The Mounties, back in their cars, sat for a few moments eyeing the group still standing just outside the lock-up door. The men seemed angrier now with the crisis past. I could hear their voices raised loudly, venting afterthoughts, regrets about what seemed now to have been a moment lost, words unsaid, deeds undone. I turned to leave. And then the grandmother was at my side. Years ago, we called her Caddy. She still retained the basics of her youthful prettiness, clear blue eyes, strong cheekbones. But she seemed haggard now, face grim. I saw the look he gave you, she said. How do you know that piece of garbage? It's a very long story, I said. I wanted to say more, but felt the weight of strangeness. She said, you haven't changed much, Tony. Well, I was devastated when I heard, I said, embarrassed by the banality, but at a loss for anything more meaningful. She didn't seem to notice. She was looking toward her relatives, who were now walking away slowly, still muttering. And then she met my eyes, searching. We'll never get over it, you know. Something like that. People like that Strickland are ruining the place. What's happening here today? The arraignment, she said. I had to get a look at him. Don't ask me why. I'll come and visit, I said, when things settle down. Please do, she said, touching my hand briefly. She walked away, then stopped as if remembering, turned and smiled. She waved again and disappeared around the corner of the courthouse. In those early days of my retirement, I found a disproportionate sense of satisfaction in completing little obligations, even paying taxes. Former colleagues who had retired were always telling me how much they had to do. Never been so busy. Not enough hours in the day. A load of crap, as I had learned in the first 5 months I'd been back here. Days spread out in front of me as vast, uncultivated plains. So my expedition to the courthouse had been something to look forward to, and the unexpected drama was a bonus. I thought of Caddy all the way home and about how strange it was that in spite of nearly 40 years and all the living in between, I'd still feel this nagging adolescent mix of sadness, anger, and embarrassment just from seeing her. I had thought about calling her since I'd moved back, but each time had been restrained by memory and a cautious nature. Considering my confused reaction to seeing her at the courthouse, I realized that my caution had been prudent. After I filed away the tax receipts in a drawer, I sat back to contemplate the ancient desk I'd brought with me from Kingston. It's an old roll top from an age when ideas turned more slowly into words, when words were written by hand. I'd also taken books, although there had been some tension over texts that Anna said she needed for her legal practice, dense volumes that mostly dealt with deviance and criminology, which were, I pointed out, my specialty as well as hers. I'd also somehow ended up with the conjugal bed. All sentiment aside, it was a good bed, and when she indicated her intent to send it to the dump, I said I'd take it. She kept almost everything else. We'd sold the Kingston house and split the equity. I kept the place in St. Ninian, the coastal village I'd grown up in, and where Anna always seemed to be vaguely miserable. Now I was here alone, for good. It was a disturbing thought, being at a dead end in a way, but I was vaguely comforted by the desk's connection with a time when I was relevant and busy, and I admired its obvious antiquity and quality as I sat in front of it with my fingers laced across my stomach the way an old man sits. The stomach, I noted with some chagrin, had become substantial. I'd been told the upside of divorce is often weight loss, but if anything, I'd gained. The Kingston doctor had cautioned me that 2 life changes close together, retirement and divorce, might constitute a psychic overload, and to be careful with the comfort food and booze. He offered pills. I'd never needed pills before, even in the most stressful periods of my working life. I didn't trust pills. Oh, he said I needn't worry. The pill he had in mind would be innocuous. It might cause some dryness in the mouth, a fuzzy brain at first, and perhaps occasionally an inappropriate erection, which at my age might not be entirely a bad thing. At my age, I asked rather sourly, what would you consider inappropriate? He laughed. You'll have to be the judge. Well, I've been on the pills ever since, with no apparent side effects.
So thank you for sharing those passages. There's so much in there. Maybe we could break it down by pulling a few themes out and ask you to speak about them. The themes, Linden, the themes. Thinking about the passage you shared, Don, from Long Change, reading the text, there's this constant reminder that the thing you're thinking about a lot is time. The way the chapters are broken down, they announce a space, often a city or a country, and a year. And I think there's gaps in between those times that there's absences and gaps in your stories as well. So I think what's interesting about the novel form is you enter it wanting to think through these types of narrative choices.
Well, in terms of the whole time aspect, it grew out of the fact that that Rit, the main character, is a geologist, and that's really his kind of grandest passion. But it's also what most roots him in the world, because he grew up in this a very constricted Pentecostal background in rural Texas, and fled when he was 15 because of a violent incident, and so he's a kind of self-created guy. He has no real family, and after his third divorce, he's no longer connected, doesn't have kids. So this is really his primary and kind of elemental relationship with anything is with the earth, and he understands time in geologic terms, so that he recognizes that not only will he be gone, and all of us will be gone, but in fact, all the civilizations at some point will be gone, and everything that's been written will be gone, and all that's going to be left are these rocks, and this is going to be the only record worth studying ultimately. And so that's the whole kind of time aspect sort of flows from that.
This beautiful passage where you announce geologic time, suddenly in a hurry, a speeding up time-lapse version. Was that a passage you wanted to write in this novel?
Yeah, because that's those are the passages that are the most fun, I think, because you suddenly, hit on this idea, and it's going to have an element of surrealism to it. And those scenes are always so engaging, I think, for the writer. And years ago, I interviewed Mordecai Richter, and he said, you have these scenes where you don't even know where they come from. They just kind of announce themselves, and you put them on the page, and they're fun, and they're buoyant, and you can feel they're alive. And he said, and you write them in a day. And then he said those passages that are connecting two of those things together, he said it would take 3 weeks to write, and when he reread his own work, he would just see those passages, and they just sat there, and they were they're so perfunctory, and they're necessary from an architectural perspective, but you just don't have the same sort of creative investment. And so that's one of those passages that was fun to write for me. Yeah.
Thank you. And Linden, I was wanting to ask you about memory in your narrative fiction, and I wonder if there's parallels to time. Looking at Causeway, rereading a passage this morning, there's a very powerful scene in which you recall the time when your grandfather's funeral procession, and you had to dig out the driveway.
Oh, yeah.
And you speak to it in the paragraph below, and you recall that very powerful scene as an image and how it comes back. And this transition is into the next chapter. You actually write about the past in the present as if you were back then at that time. I was wondering, in this passage you read as well, why is memory the thing that keeps guiding your narrative fiction? The Bishop's Man is a very complex text, and often in sentences and between paragraphs, there's a lot of keeping up with the memories of the characters. Could you speak to memory, as I just asked Don to speak about time?
Well, memory is, on the one hand, the only thing that we know for sure, but oddly enough, it's the one thing that we get mixed up in. And I think that's where you find the most fruitful exploration, the constant going into, and not just your personal memory, but as much as possible using your personal memory as as a portal for a larger and more universal experience. And so I'm totally fascinated with how we remember things. I'm totally fascinated by the impact on who we become in how we remember things. And of course, when you have to make use of, when you're trying to figure something out, like who was my father? Where did he come from? Well, he had an extremely interesting upbringing. You know, he'd never gone to school. He lived in a place where they spoke a dying language, Gaelic language, until he was, well, all their lives. I mean, he didn't even learn to speak English till he was about 9 or 10. And that scene you're talking about, where my grandfather, when he died at the age of 95, as was the practice, you know, this was in the 60s, 1967 actually, they had the wake in the house. And the night of his wake, there was a snowstorm, so they were up on a mountainside, and we had to walk up through the trees to this. And we get there, and all the old people, like really old people, are there, and like their contemporaries. How did they get there? I had no idea how they got there, and they were up all night long, and the snow continued to fall, and they were all talking this dying language. My grandmother, who was 93, caught one of these old fellows drinking in the presence of the corpse. He had a bottle out, and he was speaking Gaelic to the corpse, and she physically removed him from the building. She threw him out into the snow. A 93-year-old frail woman, and so that went all night long. And in the morning, we realized, okay, we have to get a truck up here somehow to haul the casket out. And the road we were out there. We were shoveling snow. We were chopping down trees and putting them over the soft spots. And soon enough, a big old truck groaned up the hill and into the yard and backed up, and we all carried out my grandfather in his box, put him on the back of the truck, and then we had to dispatch people to sit on top of it so it wouldn't fall off. I mean, this is a memory that at the time is tedious, it's bizarre, it's all the rest of it, but it's only a little bit later on when you sort of reconstitute it in your head that you realize this is a portal into a time and into a world that you will never have lived in, except for this glancing moment where you passed by the edge of it. But this was the world and the time that they all were shaped by. This was the time and the world that my father was shaped by. This language that's swirling around me, of which I'm picking up snatches and bits and, you know, enough to understand what they're talking about, but not enough to participate. This is the language that for 1,000 years shaped the way these people think. And it's flickering here, it's practically extinguished, but it's still flickering, and I am privileged. Now this is not what I'm thinking that night. I'm thinking, like, how long is this night going to last? But, you know, 10 years, 20 years later, you're going back over and saying, wow. I mean, it's like your professor. I mean, I could stand in front of a lot of professors and psychiatrists and psychologists and clergy and never get as close to an essence of where I come from as I got on that very long, snowy, bizarre night.
Thank you for sharing that. And waking in the home is still a cherished tradition in Cape Breton, so it still flickers on, as you said. Responding to that.
In Bay St. Lawrence, where Joel grew up, and his relatives are now living in, this is how small the world is, in the houses that my relatives used to live in. But I remember when my grandmother was one of the last people to live there part-time, and you know, the local folk, they went up on the hill, and they dug the grave in the wintertime, and they all thought the world of her, but they couldn't keep the water out of the grave. And somebody remarked, poor Mary Donahue was going to a watery grave, and everybody and she did.
These are strong people. Don, could you respond and maybe pick up to what Linden was talking about, that this personal memory can actually connect you with this collective past? And if you don't mind me saying, I think there's part of your novel is trying to archive or document this recent history in Canada. and what that might mean in the oil fields of Alberta. Would that be a good estimation?
Yeah, because one of the things I thought about when I was writing this book is, and this happened afterwards, but at the G7 summit in June, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel came out and said, we've decided we're going to decarbonize by the end of the century, and that the Western nations are on board. And I thought if that is actually the case, then it would put us roughly at the midway point of oil's operational life. And like so many of us, it seems to be going through a midlife crisis, and it's kind of responding the way men often do in their kind of red sports car buying, let's date a 20-year-old waitress phase. And I thought that the oil business is kind of losing its mind, and it's an interesting moment to look at it, but to examine it, you have to kind of go back to, how did it get to this point? Because in the book, the tone sort of changes. It starts off in Texas, where Rit's working as a roughneck, as a 15-year-old roughneck, and it's in the 50s, and so it's kind of rooted at that point. And then by the time you get to the 70s and the boom happens, I think there was a moment when it becomes unrooted, and there was a sense of a kind of surrealism in the oil business, certainly in Calgary when that boom happened, because it swept so much up with it that everyone who owned a house and saw their real estate, multiply, felt that they were, becoming millionaires, and it really affected the entire kind of civic psychology, I think. And so to look at the book sort of ends in an indeterminate future, but you have to kind of go back and look at that. And so that's also one of the reasons I went to, in the book he goes to Azerbaijan, which was one of the first commercial oil producing areas in the world. In the early 20th century it started producing oil, and then it was kind of closed down. It was reopened to the West in the early 90s, and it became sort of the Wild West. Every major oil company came to Azerbaijan to try and get a piece of this. It was called the Caspian Derby, and all the oil people had to stay in the same hotel in Azerbaijan, and the reason for that was that every room was bugged, and they could listen to what all these guys were saying, and they realized that these rooms were bugged. And so when they were trying to and the government was a kind of cobbled together coalition, and when they were the oilmen were sitting in their rooms frustrated, and they were trying to get a deal going, and they would just yell into their room they wanted a meeting with the Minister of Resources, and then phone would ring an hour later saying, here it is, you've got a meeting set up. So I wanted to kind of look at the madness that led to the final act, as it were, in the book.
And if for a second, could you actually comment on how you started to think through that surrealism that starts to happen as the book goes on? What type of devices did you use to make it feel like that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that happens is that because Rit's in his 80s near the end of the book, he's starting to exhibit the first signs of dementia, and so his dementia is kind of in lockstep with what is a sort of larger dementia in the industry, basically. So I use that as a kind of device.
Very effectively, I may add. Linden, I was going to turn to you and maybe respond directly to the passage you read. I was hoping for you to speak to the title, to punishment, to redemption. I was watching a video clip that came from a keynote you did at the Halifax Library, and I think that was this year. And
I hate that. Once upon a time, you could make these appearances and nobody would ever know, and you could have one little speech and you gave it everywhere, and now these people go to YouTube and they find it's not fair.
You're on the keynote circuit now. You said, and it was speaking toward the court of public opinion that really your novel is about, and you mentioned this public appetite for punishment. A quote from the book says, "Penitence and punishment, the false promise of redemption." Could you speak to the title and how it plays itself out in the book?
The title came to me. I often have a title before, a working title that sort of sticks, but this one came halfway through it we were hearing so much about law and order and punishment and 3 strikes you're out and lock them up and throw away the key. I knew it was going to become an election issue in 2015. I didn't have any idea how it was going to play. I had a sense that people were getting awfully sick of being afraid of terrorists and criminals. And I have this awful feeling that an awful lot of people that are making our policies and our laws and trying to shape public opinion about crime and punishment don't know anything about crime or criminals. Whereas one of the side, unplanned parts of my journalistic experience is to have been inside of practically every correctional institution in the country and to have met this enormous cross-section of criminals incarcerated and to have got to know a number of them quite well. And never to have sort of gone all sort of squishy about them because, they're in there because most cases they've done some terrible things. But as I mentioned last night, you eventually come to the conclusion you have to separate who they are from what they've done. You can't say they have done this, therefore, this wicked thing, therefore they are inherently wicked. Because when you get to know them, you realize that there are such complicated reasons for why they did something. And probably the worst things that people did, like killing other people, were done in a flash. It's a rare individual who hires himself out to kill people, in spite of the movies. Most of the people that are in, they just lost it under the influence of alcohol or drugs or passion or what have you, and then they did it and they get life 25. So anyway, I was fascinated with the ambiguities of crime and the complexity of the criminal personality. And I started out cursing Dostoevsky for his decision 150 years ago to call the book Crime and Punishment. I said, I can't very well do that. But then I realized that the story I want to tell is about punishment where there was no crime. I don't want to give too much away about the book. Of course, everybody here has read it, so I don't have to worry about it. But what happens when you have a general public perception that a crime has happened because a very bad thing has happened, and the simplest way to explain the bad thing that happened without having any personal sense of responsibility for it is to be able to nail somebody for having done it. And it becomes very important to nail that person whether they did it or not. And so what happens in a small community populated by absolutely decent, law-abiding, God-fearing, good people, and the bad thing happens. And so rather than explore the conditions of life in the community, or rather to get into the messy business of assessing the functionality of the family that this victim came from, you pick the obvious candidate, and you're going to make that stick, no matter what the evidence is. And then what happens when the courts of the justice system come to the conclusion, we do not have any evidence of a crime here. We have no evidence that he did it. But in the court of public opinion, he's already been convicted. So you got this huge gap. And with the wrong influences in the community, agitation, prejudice, bigotry, intolerance, fermenting in the middle of that gap, you will end up with a crime that's even worse than the crime that started the whole ball rolling in the first place. So that's a little bit about where I wanted to go with this. And I found a parallel with what was going on in Iraq. We had a terrible thing happen in New York City in 2001. We had this, Americans did not want to have a hard look at the root causes of that. So the simplest thing was, with the influence of their leadership, to find the villain. In this particular case, he was a villain, but he wasn't a villain in that particular crime. So we will build a case against him to justify what turned out to be a vigilante action. So I said, if you take the principles of that kind of justice and you put them to work in a small community with a smaller crime, you end up with the same results, which is chaos. You end up with injustice. You end up with crimes that are worse than the original incident.
Thank you for sharing. The 3 main characters in the text in some ways all represent one side of the law or the other. It's a great book. I think it's time to open it up to audience Q&A. So do we have questions?
I absolutely love the book Punishment because I just finished it and I couldn't put it down when I picked it up, that means it's a wonderful book in my estimation. But one of the things that struck me quite early on was it seemed to me the crime was what took place in the prison, and in fact why Tony is back home.
Yes, and those crimes were swept under the rug. I mean, there was a crime that involved Strickland from the inmate side, brutal killing, and then there was a crime that involved Tony on the staff side, which was another brutal killing that they sanctioned. And now Dwayne Strickland benefited because he ratted out the crime that the inmates had committed in a way, but Tony tried to do the right thing.
And he was punished.
And he was punished.
I thought that. And we had an incident at our jail, so
Yes.
also, so it was very local and that was a terrifying scene you wrote. It was,
Well, and
it
I
was
can
fabulous.
I can tell you, since you brought it up, both of those crimes that are described were based on real incidents that happened one at Millhaven Penitentiary and the other at Kingston Penitentiary that I was familiar with, and they never became public issues. They never became big stories, but I knew, because I knew inmates who were involved, and I knew that they were in the place at the time. I knew from them that these things had happened. You know, guards just allowed a bunch of inmates to murder a troublemaker. In Millhaven, during a prisoners' riot where they took control of the range, there was a guy there they didn't like. There was a rumor around that he was a child molester. They tortured him to death. And he wasn't he wasn't a sex offender. So these are things that go on in the system. And then we see the outcroppings of how the justice system works on the outside, and it's not at all a reflection of the real world.
Do we have another question from the audience?
Lots of thought.
Would you like to share some?
Well, here. These are my notes.
This man has notes.
Starting with Linden last night, and carrying on with the two of you today. I have lots of thoughts. I guess it's a compliment. It's not a question, it's a compliment. I'm so glad you're here.
The second thing to go is your hearing.
Yeah. The father, was it Father McSweeney? Is that his name? Is this at St. FX?
Yes.
Interesting. The reason why I say interesting is because many, many years ago, I was in the RCAF and I wanted to continue my education. And I was encouraged by my senior, an officer, and he said, well, I went to UNB. I know you're from Ontario, but I went to UNB. Whatever universities you reach out to, you might want to include Mount A, UNB, and St. FX. So I applied to 6 universities, and the only one that turned me down was St. FX. And the reason why, because I put my religion down as Baptist.
Oh dear.
They say, you're
You
out of
belonged
here.
in Acadia.
Huh? What's that?
Or Mount A. I mean, Mount A might have taken you because they were kind of wishy-washy United Church people. But
Yeah, yeah. No, they were the first one to accept me.
Thank you. Do we have another question from the audience? Another, there we go. You could wait for the mic if you don't mind?
Do you think that the caucus of the new prime minister comes from his head or from the selective collective of the liberals? How do we discern what's in his head as an original thing and what's just been dictated as an evolution in the Liberal Party? I don't know. You don't have to answer that question. It may not be relevant.
can you
Thank you.
repeat that, Joel? Just tell me, boil that down.
He was thinking about the newly formed Liberal Party under Trudeau, and he wanted to know how we can discern where the ideas come from. Is it from the head of Trudeau the Junior, or is it from the head of the assembly he puts together? And maybe you can both take a crack at this.
Yeah, well, I'm very simply, I'm going to be objective. I don't want to get into a political discussion. I think what Justin Trudeau has foremost in his mind is the Constitution that was brought to the country, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that his father created, and that over the past 10 years has been seriously under siege from a small C conservative kind of libertarian attitude in which there's a suspicion of judges and there's a suspicion of courts and there's a suspicion of constitutional principles. And so what has happened is that there has been an erosion. There's a whole lot of, I mean, the first thing that the new Minister of Justice has to do is decide whether they're going to proceed with a lot of court challenges that the Harper government put in place, where courts shot down legislation, and the Harper government decided to appeal to a higher court to try and get that legislation. And invariably, the legislation was shot down on constitutional grounds. So I think that the drive initially of the new Trudeau government will be to try to bring the country back to laws and government that hews more closely to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that oddly enough, his father brought into being in the country.
I think, if the question is Justin Trudeau his own man, then I think he's probably more his own man than we suspect, because I think the Liberal Party learned a valuable lesson with Ignatieff, which was, Ignatieff was a very bright guy and from a kind of Brahmin background, and the handlers around him tried to remake him as this populist everyman, and he doesn't have a populist bone in his body. And I taught at the Banff Center with him years ago, and he's a lovely guy and really interesting, but they didn't play to his strengths, which was he should have actually played up on that, become the next Pierre Trudeau and be the intellectual prime minister. And it was just an absolute catastrophe when he was kind of betwixt and between, and that epic failure, I think, sent a message that they can't send Justin too far down a path that he's not already on himself. So I would suspect, and I also think he's someone who grew into this job on the campaign trail to a much greater extent than we suspect. And I would think that he had a great deal of input in this, also taking the advice from that old guard from McCallum and Goodell and those people. But I would suspect that he has a pretty healthy input at this point.
His two most trusted advisors, and they seem to stand head and shoulders above the old guard and everybody else, are Katie Telford and Jerry Butts. And these are people he has a lot of history with. He's known Butts since they were in school in university. He's very tight with Dominic LeBlanc, who lived at Rideau Hall when Justin was living at 24 Sussex Drive. And Justin, when he was walking up the driveway the other day, it was remembered, that as a little boy he used to run up that driveway to play with Dominic, who was approximately his age. So he's his own man, but I think who he is being reinforced by people like him and who are close to him, people that he trusts a great deal, because based on long experience and mutual respect. I mean, a lot of the old guard, you hear them, you bump into them all, because I'm part of their generation. I remember them when they were a young guard, and they were very much part of that he isn't ready mindset all along, and they'd be cringing at, he said so. And I'm saying to myself, what he is saying might make you cringe, but it doesn't make your grandchildren cringe by a long shot. And if saying these things will persuade your grandchildren and my grandchildren and that generation, the millennial crowd, if that'll persuade them to come out and vote, he's a shoo-in. because we're just not hearing it the same way that the people that matter are.
Is there a final question from the audience? One more? I'll let you have it.
One of the things that in both the Bishopman and Punishment for me comes out, the difference between secrets and the truth. So in the Bishopman, certainly a lot is revealed about the secrets. And then, so I picked up Punishment, and I was quite struck when Tony was quite quick to believe about his fatherhood. And I began to see that we think if secrets were all revealed, it will bring us, some enlightenment. And yet in both your books, when the truth is revealed, it's quite unhappy. And so I just wondered about the idea of secrets being revealed.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, if everything was completely transparent, if you said, if everything was the truth, if every utterance that came out of your mouth was true, there'd be chaos. You'd be constantly, like, if people could read, if I'm in an airport lounge and I'm looking around at people doing stuff, and if they could read my mind, I would be arrested. And it's unbelievable, like what goes on in our heads that should stay there. And
You'd make it on the Fifth Estate.
Oh, exactly. I mean, the secret thing. There are secrets to start with what you really think about what so and so is wearing. Then there are secrets that are. You see, I believe in the motivation behind everything. Morality is defined by motivation. Why are people keeping secrets? Are they keeping secrets because there's something that hasn't been resolved yet, and it would be premature for everybody to know? They're devising a budget. Well, they're going to keep an awful lot of that stuff secret until they got the final thing, and then it'll be revealed. Or are they keeping secret stuff because they don't want us to really think much about what they're up to overall? I mean, the motivation, if the motivation is to keep us in the dark so that we can be manipulated or misled or taken down a road that is not going to be good for us, then that's the wrong kind of secrecy. So in The Bishop's Man, The Bishop's Man is basically about a guy who believes that the secrets are being preserved for the greater good, which is the integrity and the credibility of this institution that means everything to him, and to the decent, good, intelligent people who run it. And so we shouldn't reveal the secrets of the pedophiles and what they're up to, because it detracts from the larger cause. Until he suddenly realizes that he doesn't believe this. He has a core morality of his own, and increasingly he realizes that he's suppressing that in the interest of this abstract institutional morality. And then he begins to see, well, the institutional morality is designed to perpetuate not just the institution, but certain individuals who are in powerful positions in the institution. And that this awareness of a moral contradiction between his own sense of what's right and wrong, which we're born with, and the sense of right and wrong that's defined by this institution, this gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger as he has to do all these nasty things, and he begins to fall apart, which is what happens to us when we are consciously and persistently doing what we don't believe in doing and think actually to be the wrong thing to do. So he eventually, the secrets begin to tear him apart. And it's the same with Tony and the secret of what they did on that prison range on that particular day. It just becomes unbearable to him. So it has to come out one way or the other.
Don, if you could, I'd love to hear your response to that too. I think the central character, the protagonist of Long Change Writ, moves from Texas to Alberta, harboring some secret. Maybe you could respond to that.
Yeah, in his case, he's in a bar fight when he's 15 years old. He's big for his age. He's in a bar and he gets in a fight, and he believes he may have killed a man, and so that's why he's fleeing Texas, and he has this in his head for years. So he doesn't go back till I think he's almost 30 by the time he heads back to Texas, and he actually goes back and goes to a library in the nearest town and looks at the newspapers to see if in fact he'd killed this guy, because he assumes it would be reported. But for 15 years or so, he's got this sitting in his head, and his life is being conducted along these lines, and then he finds out, he looks in the paper and he finds this incident, and it isn't clear, but he gets the name of the guy who assaulted him and who he believes he'd killed, is released, and he actually goes to the guy's house, and of course, and the guy's there, and he just wants to see him in the flesh to make it clear to him that in fact he was innocent of this. And it is, in this case, it is a liberating thing, because he's been keeping the secret from everyone he knows, certainly, but also to some degree from himself. It's just sitting in there kind of festering.
Thank you. As a final question, what can we expect next? What's under your roll-top desk, Linden?
Well, it's bad luck to say what's going to be next, whether it's...
You got to keep it secret.
I have to keep it secret, though. I've got a manuscript that is in the hands of an editor, but that doesn't mean anything. People who tell me they're writing books, I tell them it's not a book until somebody tells you it's a book. Until then, it's a project. So I've got a project underway, and I'll find out fairly soon whether or not it's a book.
Okay, so we got a project here, and Don?
And I actually have I have a project with the same editor. So we're sitting there with her. She hasn't seen mine yet, but I was going to send it in this week. So we'll both wait. And mine is a nonfiction project, but I perhaps shouldn't talk too much about it. So there you go, 2 secret projects, and you may read about them in a year from now. So hopefully.
The editor invited us both to dinner at her house a couple of weeks ago, and I went there and said, well, she'll say something. No.
Yeah.
So neighbors, the same editor, Linden MacIntyre, Don Gillmor. Let's clap for them.
Thank you very much.